although he is not necessarily wanting to be understood or seen as a historian, he covers many different areas, including literature, American studies, and the reason I say that is that if you go around the country and you look at different departments, his work is taught in different departments, not simply limited to what he sees as his disciplinary area. So we're very happy to have him, and we're very happy that we're going to have an opportunity to hear him talk about slavery and class in the American South, a generation of slave narrative testimony. I want to remind you that you should have received a evaluation form, and we're going to ask that before you leave that you let us have your evaluation form. And we also want to remind you that on Thursday we'll be doing our last talk with Herman Bennett, and we'll be right back in this same place. Herman Bennett from it's not NYU, but I'll remember the name before we finish.
The New School.
The New, pardon me?
The Graduate School.
The Graduate School, of course. All right, so as we begin, we're going to leave time at the end for questions, and I know you'll be happy to answer those. So if you need to move up, if you'd like to move up before we begin, you can actually do that. There you are. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Professor Andrews.
Well, thanks everyone for coming out. April is always the toughest month as far as all the things that you have to do. And so I appreciate your taking out some time to come and be here and be a part of this. I'm going to talk for about 40-45 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for a question and answer. I'm very glad to have a chance to speak under the auspices of the Stone Center, so I'm very pleased that this is the particular venue under which I get to talk about my newest book, which is, as Joseph said, Slavery and Class in the American South, A Generation of Slave Narrative Testimony, 1840 to 1865. The subtitle of the book refers to the fact that my book draws on all the slave narratives that were published between 1840 and 1865. Most people write about a few of the narratives, especially the most famous people who wrote the narratives, people like Frederick Douglass, or Harriet Jacobs, or William Wells Brown. I write about them too. They're in my book. But my book is about a great many people whose narratives have not been discussed much, if at all. But they also wrote narratives between 1840 and 1865. And it's important, if you're going to understand class, to understand what everybody had to say about their experience in slavery, and therefore their experience of class as well. Not just what the most famous people had to say about it. So my book is an attempt to give you a sort of portrait of an entire generation based on what everyone had to say in the narratives that they produced during the 25 years, the quarter century, when the African American slave narrative was widely read all over the world, all over the English-speaking world, translated into multiple European languages, German, French, Dutch, published in many venues in the United States, in Great Britain, in Ireland, and of course in various translated forms in different capitals in Europe. So, first I'm going to read the preface to my book. It helps to explain why understanding American slavery is fundamental to an understanding of America, of what America was and still is. And then after I do that, I will talk about my book in terms of this whole theme of class within slavery. Those of you who've read a slave narrative or more than one will recognize the way my story begins is a sort of homage to the ways that the famous slave narratives, many of them, begin. I was born in Richmond, Virginia in 1946 in a hospital on Monument Avenue named in honor of Robert E. Lee's cavalry commander James Ewell Brown Jeb Stewart. Among my paternal and maternal forebears are more men who fought for the Confederacy than I can easily count. Half of my great-great-grandfathers were slaveholders. The others, as far as I can tell, weren't. In the 1860 U.S. Census, Edwin Garnett Andrews, 1805 to 1861, who farmed in Caroline County, Virginia, claimed 6 human beings ranging in age from 4 months to 53 years as his property. John Fernyhough Jr., 1788 to 1860, a prosperous coachmaker, enjoyed the profits of a small estate near Fredericksburg, Virginia, maintained by 16 men and women whom he enslaved. In 1835, Fernyhough joined an anti-abolition vigilance committee in Fredericksburg, the purpose of which, according to a local newspaper, was, quote, to aid the civil authorities in detecting and bringing to justice the abolitionists engaged in disseminating their nefarious publications and prosecuting their incendiary projects, unquote. These 2 great-great-grandfathers of mine would have never imagined that a descendant of theirs would one day devote 40 years of his life to studying and reprinting nefarious publications of American abolitionism that John Fernyhough and his committee in Fredericksburg tried to criminalize and suppress. Though undoubtedly an outrage to slaveholders like Fernyhough, the narratives of former slaves who testified against chattel slavery have become for me the most instructive and inspiring, albeit often appalling, human documents ever produced by the antebellum South. From these narratives, I've realized that the four basic defining institutions of the United States at its founding, namely democracy, capitalism, Protestant Christianity, and marriage, were profoundly corrupted by the 5th defining institution of the United States at its inception, slavery. So the basic political institution of the United States has always been representative democracy. But in a country that from its founding denied the franchise to anyone who was enslaved, and in some antebellum northern states to anyone of African descent, the new nation's experiment in representative democracy was imperiled from the outset. The notorious 3/5 Compromise of 1787, by which the slave states were permitted to count each enslaved individual in their population as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of congressional apportionment, perverted the Constitution of the United States into a pro-slavery document from the day it was written. The author of the first fugitive slave narrative in American history, my fellow Virginian William Grimes, closed his 1825 autobiography with a sardonic offer. He would leave his whip-scarred skin, quoting him now, a legacy to the government, desiring that it might be taken off and made into parchment, and then bind the Constitution of glorious, happy, and free America, unquote. In economics, the defining institution of the United States, of course, is capitalism. But before the Civil War, free enterprise and free markets had little meaning to enslaved African Americans, despite the fact that their minds and bodies were the most profitable commodities made in America. In 1849, Kentucky fugitive Henry Bibb diagnosed the power of rich slaveholders over those he called the poor laboring man. Whether he be moral or immoral, honest or dishonest, white or black, if he performs manual labor for a livelihood, he is but little better off than the slave, who toils without wages under the lash. Profoundly dependent on a self-perpetuating caste of lifelong unpaid labor, Southern slaveholders and Northern industrialists allied to pit Southern working-class whites and enslaved blacks against each other throughout the 19th century, and most of the 20th as well. In American religious life, Protestant Christianity was the founding religious institution of the United States. The basic tenet of Protestantism was and is the priesthood of all believers. In its most radical form, this revolutionary idea prescribed literacy for the laity, so that each Christian could read the Bible and become his or her own interpreter of the Scripture. In the Southern slavocracy, however, especially after the Nat Turner Revolt of 1831, the idea of slaves reading and interpreting the Bible freely was anathema. In his 1860 narrative, fugitive James Watkins denounced Southern ministers for declaring, and here I'm quoting him, "It would not do to give the enslaved the Bible because it would unfit them for their duties. They would become impudent and above their business," unquote. The interests of slavery defiled and in many cases blunted the central evangelical aim of Protestant Christianity in half the United States. In the social realm, the defining institution of the young republic was marriage and the nuclear family. But slavery's corrosive effects in the South were perhaps most damaging there, and therefore most often denied. For the enslaved, family ties could be sundered whenever a slaver decided to sell a mother, father, son, or daughter. The majority of antebellum slave narratives recount at least one such sale in the narrator's own family. Some slaveholders allowed or even encouraged their human property to marry, but everyone knew these marriages had no legal standing. Many male slaveholders were as indifferent to their own marriage vows as they were to the sanctity of the marriages of their slaves. Here's a quotation from Mary Boykin Chestnut, wife of a slaveholding U.S. senator from South Carolina, when she confided to her diary in March 1861, quote, "Like the patriarchs of old, our men live all in one house with their wives and their concubines. And the mulattoes one sees in every family exactly resemble white children. And every lady tells you who is the father of all the mulatto children in everybody's household, but those in her own, she seems to think, drop from the clouds, or pretends so to think," unquote. With representative democracy, capitalism, Protestant Christianity, and marriage, slavery belongs among the 5 most influential institutions in the founding of the United States, simply because slavery was so deeply rooted in the country by the time it was founded that it distorted and perverted all the other 4. Today, of course, the United States is still swimming and trying not to drown in the noxious backwash of slavery. One way to chart our course away from destructive misunderstandings of our national past is to consult the personal histories of African American men and women who resisted their enslavement and extricated themselves from it. Between 1840 and 1865, that is, as I've already said, the quarter-century international heyday of the African American slave narrative, the narratives of former slaves such as Frederick Douglass, William Wells Brown, Josiah Henson, Sojourner Truth, Solomon Northup, captured the imagination and aroused the social conscience of thousands of readers across America, Great Britain, and Western Europe. Since the 1960s, scholars have revived the testimony of many other former slaves, from William Grimes in 1825 to Harriet Jacobs in 1861. Readers today may learn more about the best and worst aspects of our national history by reading these texts. The great slave narratives of the antebellum United States reveal in chilling detail the depths of depravity into which slaveholding led many white people. The most inspiring features of the same narratives recount the fortitude, faith, bravery, and dignity of those who committed themselves to the highest ideals of America despite the crushing burden of slavery. How these men and women attained their freedom and then witnessed fearlessly against slavery when it was the law of the United States offers every reader a heroic model from a conflict-ridden past, fully deserving of memorials, if not monuments, in the present. Now I'm going to talk about a few basic elements of my book. And I'll be quoting a great deal from the men and women who wrote the narratives or produced the narratives on which this book is based. This will help me to illustrate how important class was in the lives and the self-awareness of the people who wrote the narratives, and thus give us such important perspectives on how slavery worked and what its effects were in the American South before emancipation came in 1865. So my book explores and explains class, starting out from a realization that slaveholders divided the enslaved into categories of workers. Most of them relatively unskilled. These people we would call agricultural workers, or known in their own time as field hands. These are unskilled or semi-skilled workers. These are the majority of the people who worked in the South, primarily in rural areas. But then slaveholders also created ranks and opportunities for more skilled slaves, men and women who had special kinds of skills and who exercised those skills in urban areas or in rural areas. From the different classes of work that the enslaved did, evolved social distinctions, higher and lower ranks, even material differences among the enslaved. Slaveholding law stipulated that all slaves were the same. They had no rights. They were people who were considered property. Slaveholding practice did not always follow the strictures of the law, which is why social distinctions, material differences, what I call class awareness, became widespread among the enslaved, particularly among those who lived and worked in the higher echelons of slavery. The majority of the slave narratives that we read and study today came from people who, when they left slavery, either through buying themselves out or running away, were at the highest echelons of slavery, not the lowest. They were at the highest echelons. And frankly, that made it easier for them to get out. It's much easier to get out if you're at sort of the top of this system than if you're at the ground floor, at the very bottom of the system. So, in many of the classic slave narratives, some of which I imagine you have read, self-esteem, upward aspiration, as well as resistance to slaveholding authority emerge in the context of, and often as a consequence of, a sense of class distinction among the men and women who produced these narratives. Where did these traits and qualities come from that spurred some slaves to keep pushing for opportunities and rewards, to keep trying to get better and better jobs, even though they were all reserved for slaves, who were constantly pushing for a greater degree of freedom, of choice, of option, even while they were enslaved? Where did these qualities come from? My research in my book, that's the cover of it there, shows how much class was a factor in the lives, the thinking, the views and the values of these aspiring men and women caught up in slavery and trying to make the most of the situation they found themselves in. Class was an extremely important factor in the growing conviction among some of these upwardly mobile people that ultimately nothing slavery could offer in the way of rewards, opportunities, what they called privileges, could ever be satisfactory, ever be satisfying. Nothing less than freedom would satisfy. The world-famous narratives of people like Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown and Solomon Northup and Harriet Jacobs reveal how class distinction based on two things, either differences in material resources or differences, what I call social power, gave some slaves opportunities and rewards that the majority of the enslaved did not have. This does not mean that those in the higher echelons, Douglass, Jacobs, William Wells Brown, Solomon Northup, this does not mean that they had it easy in slavery. Certainly not. But my book does show that the best-known slave narratives sought out and took advantage of opportunities and rewards available to them, and then distinguished themselves socially and economically, not only in the eyes of their fellow slaves, but in the eyes of many whites, in many cases slaveholders themselves. So it may seem paradoxical, but in fact the majority of the slave narratives are not only, that is between 1840 and 1865, are not only produced by people who come from the highest echelons of slavery, but the majority of these stories are actually stories about social mobility within slavery. Within slavery. So consider the trajectory of the life of Sally Williams. Sally Williams, her autobiography, as you can see here, the title and the date, published in Cincinnati. She was born on a farm outside Fayetteville in North Carolina. She was put to work at the age of 12. She was put to work, as many women were, as the majority of women who were enslaved were. She was put to work as an agricultural worker. She worked outdoors in the most punishing, the most difficult kind of work that the enslaved did. So at the age of 12, she's a so-called field hand. By the time she's 13, she's married because her mistress required her to marry. By the time she's 17, she has 2 children. After a severe whipping, she decides to hide out with her children in the home of a hired female slave in Fayetteville. She didn't plan to go north. Her plan was to find a white man who would let her go into business for herself. 3 months after absconding with her children, she made a deal with a white man in Fayetteville who agreed to her proposal to hire her time from him for 6 months, $6 a month. Hiring her time meant that in exchange for paying this white man $6 a month, she was free to act for herself, as the quotation says. This is everything I'm telling you is straight out of her autobiography. I'm not making any of this up. She rented a little tenement of 2 rooms in Fayetteville. She purchased a stock of various products, commenced the sale of cakes and beer of her own baking and brewing to anyone who would patronize her store. She had multiple money-making ventures that let her live in her own home, clothe her sons well, and even hire a younger female slave to help her keep house. All this while she is herself a slave. This is not to say that she had it easy in slavery. Within a few years, though a successful businesswoman, her children were sold away from her, the family was completely decimated, and she ended up in Alabama. But her oldest son, Isaac, who had himself purchased his freedom and had moved to Detroit and become a minister, found his mother and bought her freedom for $400, so that at the age of 60, she finally was able to be liberated. This is not the story that you probably think of first when you think of what is the experience of an enslaved woman. But this is a story that is very significant in terms of what I'm calling social mobility within slavery. Sally Williams was a very, very remarkable woman. And part of her story is designed to show how her Christian faith sustained her even through some of the worst experiences that she had in slavery. Another example of socio-economic mobility recounted in a slave narrative, again, through initiative, through determination, through the struggle of someone who became internationally famous and still a noted figure today. This is Josiah Henson. Josiah Henson's first autobiography was published in Boston in 1849. Harriet Beecher Stowe read it, and she would never have written Uncle Tom's Cabin if she hadn't read it. Because as she said later, after Uncle Tom's Cabin became the most widely read American book in the entire 19th century, she said, I patterned Uncle Tom on Josiah Henson. So Josiah Henson was a smart enough guy to know, well, if she's going to make me famous, I'm going to capitalize on it. He published 2 more autobiographies after Uncle Tom's Cabin. This man had an audience with Queen Victoria. He was quite a figure during his later years of his life. He was born a slave on a farm in Maryland, and he went to work, like most Southern slaves, like Sally Williams, as a field laborer. He recalled in his narrative, pride and ambition were as active in my soul as probably they ever were in that of the greatest soldier or statesman. This is a common denominator among many of the people who published narratives between 1840 and 1865. Pride, ambition, very important qualities, very much class-inflected qualities. The objects I pursued, I must admit, were not just the same as theirs. Mine were to be first in the field, whether we were hoeing, mowing, or reaping. These work habits led Henson's enslaver, a man named Isaac Riley, to promote Henson. So here, now I'm talking about social mobility. He gets promoted to what Henson calls in his autobiography, superintendent of the farm work. That's a euphemism for slave driver. And Henson works under an overseer, a white overseer. This is the typical way that slave drivers worked in slavery. These would be men who were themselves enslaved, but who were given the job of ensuring that the maximum productivity was extracted from the slaves over whom the driver worked, sometimes maximized through the use of a whip. Henson goes to Riley and says, you know that your overseer is cheating you, don't you? And after Riley listens a little while longer to Henson, not being the brightest guy, but being smart enough to figure out that Henson's telling him the truth, he fires his overseer, and guess who takes his place? So Henson moves up even more until he becomes what he says in his autobiography, that he was factotum for his master, that he was business manager for the entire operation, because he was better at it than his master was. Eventually, Henson left slavery with his wife and 3 children because he had become convinced that his master needed him a lot more than he needed his master. And so he and his wife were able to escape. Sally Williams, Josiah Henson, how many of you saw 12 Years a Slave? So in that film, it's a very, very reliable film in terms of its portrayal of what actually happens in Northup's autobiography, 12 Years a Slave, published in 1853. In that film, almost everything about that film is accurate in terms of its relationship to what Northup produced in his autobiography. He didn't write the autobiography, he hired a white man to do that. But the one thing that it doesn't tell you is what Northup makes very clear in his autobiography, is that he was a slave driver for 8 of the 12 years that he was enslaved. And you just don't know that from watching the movie. You have no idea that he worked as a slave driver. But he did. So that was, to be a driver was to be given opportunity, was to be given material rewards. Slave drivers had better footwear, they had better hats, they had better coats. Some slave drivers were allowed to own their own horses. If you're someone like Henson, you develop multiple skills. Henson became a minister. Preaching was one of his skills while he was enslaved. Preaching was one of his skills, and so he was able to earn extra money, as well as do what he felt was the Lord's work by preaching. So Sally Williams, Henson, Northup, the list goes on and on. Frederick Douglass, where was Frederick Douglass before he escaped from slavery? Where was he living? He was living in Baltimore. What was he doing as a slave? He was working as a ship's caulker. You know what a ship's caulker is? It's trade. You have to learn that trade. It's a very good trade. And he learns the trade, and he says in his autobiography, I was commanding wages equal to those of any white caulker in the docks, on the docks of Baltimore. So Douglass has moved up, 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 up. This is a boy who started out in the boondocks of the eastern shore of Maryland. By the time he's 21 years old, he's at pretty much the top of the ladder. There's not much farther he can really go in terms of social mobility, and at that point he says, okay, it's time to just get out of here. So he runs away to the north and immediately goes to the New Bedford, Massachusetts shipyard to try to get a job as a caulker. Guess what? No one will hire him. In the land of the free, Jim Crow reigns supreme. He has no chance to get a job as a caulker, so he actually has to take a step down the class ladder and becomes a day laborer because the trades are completely closed to free African American males in big cities like New Bedford. So skills within slavery, especially if you have more than one skill, make you especially valuable, and they give you leverage. Frederick Douglass was able to convince his enslaver in Baltimore to let him hire his time, so that every week he had to pay this white man a certain amount of money. The white man did nothing except show up every Saturday night and say, where's my weekly dues? Douglass rented a place for himself. He kept himself in his own tools. He clothed himself. He fed himself. In other words, he was living pretty much as a free black man, except that this white man still had the power over him to take the majority of his wages. Douglass said, I don't need that. I'm out of here. That's another story of what I'm talking about here in terms of class. So what are the factors that influence class among the enslaved? Well, obviously I've been talking about one, and that is the kind of work that you do. Think about it. Today, how do we judge class among people today? It's very much based on what kind of work do you do? What kind of job do you have? Are you a white-collar worker? Are you a blue-collar worker? You know, those old distinctions have very much to do with how class is understood. Nowadays, very much to do with how class is understood among the enslaved as well. Location is also important. That is, where do you live? Where do you work? Here's a quote from Douglass's narrative, the famous narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. Came out in 1845. He knows what he's talking about when he starts talking about a city slave because he was one. A city slave is almost a freeman compared with a slave on the plantation. So we're talking about two different classes of slaves. There are the slaves who are urban, there are the slaves who are rural. The city slave is much better fed and clothed, so those are material advantages, and enjoys privileges. Remember I used that word earlier. Privileges. For people who have no rights, slaves have no rights. Trying to find a way to get privileges is the best you can do. So you're going to go after privileges if you can get privileges, since there are no rights for a slave. Privileges altogether unknown to the slave on the plantation. So location is very important. Responsibilities and rewards or privileges, I've already mentioned those. Relationships to kin. Relationships to kin. Today, people's class identity can be very much based on what kind of people do you come from? Who are your family? Are they respected? Or are they nobodies? There's a pervasive idea that the enslaved didn't have families. They certainly did. Now, the families could be separated, and often were. That doesn't mean people didn't have families, and that doesn't mean that people didn't know who came from what sort of family. This is definitely true of Harriet Jacobs. I don't know how many of you have read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Harriet Jacobs, who was born and raised in Edenton. Her autobiography has been translated into about 20 languages worldwide. Her autobiography came out in 1861. She grew up in a town. She did not grow up on a plantation. And she said in her autobiography that if she had grown up on a plantation, she said, "I would not be a living woman today." She had an extended family. Her kin, number 4 again on the list, headed by an imposing, formerly enslaved grandmother, from whom Jacobs learned personal pride, what Jacobs called self-respect. We'd call it self-esteem. She had that big time. Her extended family of urban slaves in Edenton inculcated this sense of pride in her that enabled her to withstand the threats and harassment of a sexual predator who was her master and who wanted to convert her into his concubine. So here again is this pride factor. Where does pride come from? And what I'm arguing is that it comes from these various kinds of social factors influencing class and one's own sense of class identity. Her master, trying to bribe her into becoming a concubine, said at one point, as she puts it in the autobiography, I will make a lady of you. By which he meant, I'm going to install you in a separate little house. And all you'll have to do is just take it easy there and be available to me when I want you. She was not impressed by this, even though, of course, to be a lady in this sense meant no real hard work. This lady status, as he told her, didn't appeal to her because I believe she already thought she was a lady. She just couldn't qualify for that status because of her color. But in terms of her values, in terms of her self-respect, in terms of her refusal to give in to this man, she was always asserting the fact that she was a lady, which is one of the reasons why his wife became as intensely envious of Jacobs. Referred to her on more than one occasion as her ladyship. And when she did so, of course, she didn't mean that as a compliment. So there's a conflict that happens whenever you read in these narratives about people who were enslaved, who were referred by white people as gentlemen slaves or lady slaves. And there are a number of slave narratives in which the narrators say, I was known as a gentleman slave. And that was the sort of thing that got me into trouble. Or you've heard of Henry Box Brown? His first wife was sold away from him. The reason why she was sold away from him, as he tells us in his autobiography, is that the enslaver's wife, the enslaver was a saddle maker. His wife didn't like the fact that Henry Box Brown's wife had refined manners. She's got to go. Can't have that. So here you have sort of class envy. A saddle maker, the white saddle maker's wife, looking at her slave who may have better manners than she does. She's got to go. So when caste, remember, caste is just about color. It's just about what color are you. If you can't call yourself white and be in the white caste, then you're in the low caste. Right? But within the caste, there are classes. Within each caste, there are classes. And when those classes become fluid, then they conflict with the idea that caste can't change. You have to be in a caste and stay in that caste, and you cannot move back and forth. But if there's a conflict between class and caste, if your class status seems to conflict with your caste status, this sets alarm bells going in a lot of white people's minds. And this is when violence occurs. So in the narratives, there are a number of cases of white on black violence. And there's a class factor that's involved in that. I don't have time to talk about that now. But all of this is part of what I would call the positive aspects of class and class awareness among the enslaved. Now, I'm also going to talk about some of the negative, some of the problematic aspects of class. So there are the positive ways that we talk about class. You know, that's a classy car you got there. You know. But there are also negative implications of class, right? There's a song that Outkast made years ago dedicated to a woman called Caroline. Don't know if y'all remember that song. But they're making fun of a woman who don't think something stinks, you know, and that's the ridiculing of class among someone who thinks she's too good to associate with people like the men who are in Outkast. So anyway, here's a quotation from Henry Bibb. Henry Bibb was a fugitive slave, a well-known newspaper editor after he got out of slavery. The distinction among slaves is as marked as the classes of society are in any aristocratic community. Some refusing to associate with others whom they deem to be beneath them in point of character, color, condition, or the superior importance of their respective masters. This is one statement alluding to class distinctions among the enslaved by someone who knew, because he had been enslaved for all of his life until he escaped in his early 20s. And he had seen slavery in a variety of places in the South. He didn't just come from the upper South. He'd been down the Mississippi, and he'd come back up the Mississippi. He had gotten a pretty good panoramic look. Here's a statement from Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. This is Jacobs in her last years, the only photograph that we have, studio portrait that we have of her. Harriet Jacobs' grandmother was named Molly Horniblow, the woman from Edenton who gave her granddaughter, Harriet, so much in terms of a ground on which to build her character. And her grandmother thought so much of her granddaughter because she had not ever become sexually involved with a white man. So Jacobs writes, "I knew that I was the greatest comfort to her in her old age, and that it was a source of pride to her that I had not degraded myself like most of the slaves." So degraded herself means getting involved with a white man, allowing a white man to bribe you or coerce you, and it doesn't matter. If you get involved sexually with a white man, this Molly Horniblow is really going to say you don't belong on this pedestal anymore. But the way that Jacobs puts it, that I had not degraded myself, implies that most of the slaves had degraded themselves. That is, somehow they bore some sort of moral responsibility for having become involved in these relationships that in most cases these women had no choice in the matter. So they're being judged socially and put into a certain kind of class by someone who is, again, this is the more negative side of class that you can sometimes discover in these texts. Then there are the familiar conflicts between the people who work indoors and the people who work outdoors, the so-called domestic slaves and the agricultural workers. And this is also something that's discussed in various narratives. Here's one example. Austin Stewart was a fugitive slave from Virginia. He knew about house slaves because he had been one himself for a while, although he did other kinds of work. House servants are regarded as a privileged class. There you see privilege being used again, and class, and are sometimes greatly envied while others are bitterly hated, and too often justly, for many of them are the most despicable tale-bearers and mischief makers who will, for the sake of the favor of his master or mistress, frequently betray his fellow slave and by tattling get him severely whipped. This is not the only person in the slave narratives who talks about this. I haven't selected some anomaly here and said, here, look at this. This is something that other people talk about too. It is a part of a sample, and I could give you more of this kind of problematic negative side of the way that class distinctions could actually work to the slaveholder's advantage. Sort of divide and conquer, create enmity between groups, and exploit that. Finally, there are the ways that some of these narratives portray fugitive slaves as exemplars, as exemplary people, somehow superior to the average slave who doesn't try to run away. Remember, the fugitives constitute a tiny, tiny minority of people who escape from slavery. So here's a very prominent U.S. historian, Edward Baptist, who in a recent book said, "We tell slavery's story by heaping praise on those who escaped it through flight or death and rebellion, leaving the listener to wonder if those who didn't flee or die somehow accepted slavery." One of the problems with some of these narratives is the way that they kind of upgrade the image of the fugitive slave, but in the process downgrade the image of all of the other people who might not have chosen that route, that means of trying to assert themselves and getting a better life. So here's another quotation from a contemporary narrative. Here's a person, Austin Stewart, referring to fugitives in Canada. These fugitives may be thought of to be a class of poor, thriftless, illiterate creatures like the Southern slaves. So look at how the Southern slaves are being portrayed here. Poor, thriftless, and illiterate. But the fugitives have left them behind, and they've gone to Canada. And who are the fugitives? They are no longer slaves, many of whom have been many years free men. They are a hardy, robust class of men, very many of them men of superior intellect. Does that mean superior to the minds of the people down south? What are you saying here? Exactly what does that mean? How are we to take that? These are questions that emerge in a number of the narratives. Just the use of the rhetoric of the heroic, intrepid fugitive can somehow make it look like the people who are left behind lack something. Now, these are questions that are raised in the narratives. They're also questions that are answered in the narratives. It's not as though the narratives speak with one voice, they speak with many voices. And what I'm doing today is just giving you a sample of some of them. The final thing I want to mention in talking about this is the idea of ambiguous loss. This is something that's been discussed a good deal in the contemporary day, in our day, by psychologists and psychotherapists, talking about what happens, how do we achieve closure, whether it's even possible to achieve closure after a trauma or a tragic event in our lives. In the case of ambiguous loss, it becomes even harder because the closure that people are trying to achieve comes at a time when the person they have lost, the loved one they care so much for, is gone, but in some ways can't actually be accounted for. So let's say you have a service member who is missing in action, and the family is trying to decide what has happened to this person. Maybe they've been taken prisoner, and no word has come as to whether they're alive or dead. The same thing is for any missing person's case. Or for people whose elderly loved ones are gradually disappearing into dementia. They're still alive, but in some ways they're lost. My book talks about slave narratives registering a sense of ambiguous loss for the people who make their escape. Because when they escape, they have to leave their entire family behind. They're never going to see them again. How do you live with that? It's very easy to celebrate the heroism of people who escape, but the cost is tremendous. How do you adjust to the idea that you've left your family behind and you'll never see them again? Especially when, as a number of the narratives point out, if you run away, there will be reprisals. And the reprisals will be on the people you love the most, whom you've left behind. They're going to suffer because you decided to run away. So there are narratives in which the whole question of whether I should run away or whether I shouldn't, what do I owe my family versus what do I owe myself? These are all very important questions that I talk about in my book because they raise profound moral questions that are all too easily glossed over simply by saying, isn't it wonderful that people got free and they achieved their freedom and became heroes. And that's all true, but that's not all there is to this story. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much. Be glad to answer any questions or try to if you'd like to ask anything. Thank you. I see two hands. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So first of all, thank you so much for doing this talk and speaking with us. You named a couple of comments I wanted to ask questions about, but I'll be one of them now. You talked about the slave's sense of pride, and their self-esteem and some of these values that they had. And it seemed like you were indicating that they were through extrinsic means like class distinctions and that type of thing. But I wonder if you could speak at all to possibly intrinsic nature of the values that they had and self-esteem that didn't have to do with coming from their class distinction or something like that, external.
Well, I think that you're right. It's not that people's values come solely from a social situation or from class, but I do think that if you consider class to embrace not just what we might think of as social class, but also family, work, religious faith, which is also inculcated usually through the family, and another factor is connection to white people. That can also have an effect on one's sense of oneself. Frederick Douglass writes in the first paragraph of his narrative, he says that he doesn't know his birthday, and he couldn't understand why he didn't know his birthday, because the white children, he said, knew theirs. And so when Douglass compares himself to the white children, he doesn't name them, but they're there, and starts to say, why shouldn't I compare myself to what the white children know rather than to what all the black people I know who don't know their ages don't know? You know, that in itself is a very interesting question as to where did that come from? Did someone in his family encourage him to find that out? Or was it just being around white kids and being so young and thinking, well, really, what's the difference between them and me? You know, doesn't really understand that he's a slave and he doesn't have any rights and has to go and ask his enslaver, you know, can you tell me when my birthday was? And then the enslaver says, no, that's none of your business. So these questions of where do these traits and motives come from certainly can't be neatly sliced up and categorized and say, well, this is social class and this is personal and this is family and so on. My purpose is just to say that their motives come solely from within, as though we're just talking about a bunch of individuals who have no social context. They're just unusual people who just happen to have these great ambitions and ideals. You know, I don't think so. I think that these people are rooted in social contexts, and those social contexts are very much about their social relationships to other black people, as well as, in some cases, to white people. So that's what I'm trying to do, is I don't want to heroicize the people or turn them into kind of super individuals. I want to say they come from a world of African Americans and social relationships that mean a great deal to them and that have a great deal to do with how they conceive of themselves and how they begin to pursue a life course.
Is there, just as a quick follow-up, is there any indication that self-concept, speaking of the other factors beyond class, like what about who they were, who their families were, their histories beyond them being slaves? Like, you know, you're talking a lot about them comparing themselves to white people and that type of thing, but is there any indication that that self-concept extends beyond, you know, where they are in America, I guess, their station, their social class in America?
Not that you can see in the narratives. There's not much about that. Some people definitely have a deeper sense of family history. I mean, when Douglass writes about his grandmother, who's pretty much a cipher in the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, but in his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, he tells you a lot more about his grandmother. And he also describes her and her husband, who was not his blood kin, as old settlers in the area of the Eastern Shore in Talbot County, where Douglas was born and grew up. He knows that his family goes back several generations, and that, I think, for him is a source of pride that he can draw on.
Hello, thank
Hi.
you. I'm wondering if this differentiation between fugitive slaves and those remaining enslaved, if that dynamic or that phenomenon is played out in the migrations, if you're aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I just sort of think about the dynamics in my own family, a Southern family who owned a property, knew and related to their former white bakers.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, and thinking about the dynamics of those who migrated from the South and just were seen at the family reunions held in the farmstead. So I'm wondering if you see that dynamic played out in the migration narratives.
It makes sense. I haven't read many narratives about migration, but it certainly makes sense that people who imagine a better life and who believe that they are entitled to a better life and are not, sort of demoralized into thinking, well, what I have is all I'm ever going to get, are going to be the same kind of people as those who wrote these narratives, who, no matter what stratum they came from, because there are people who wrote narratives who did not come from the higher echelons, who came from the lowest echelons, and they got out too. It's just that most of the people who wrote these narratives did not come from the lowest strata, they came from the highest. But I think that the famous migrations to Kansas and Oklahoma around the 1880s and 1890s, the so-called exodusters, those are people who are, I think, probably less higher echelon people in terms of skills and of money, but there are people who've gone out and started the towns, and then there are people who follow. So there's it's a chicken and egg question as to whether people start going and then people with skills who say, hey, I could start a business there, because there are enough people there to continue to make the business profitable, or do they go with the business and then the people follow and settle where the businesses are? It's really kind of a chicken and egg question as far as that's concerned. The later migrations, of course, after the terrible red summers in the South, and then of course during the Depression, then I think you get a wide range of people. I think you get all sorts of people from higher and lower echelons. Joseph?
Yeah, I'm wondering if there was any hereditary elements, those individuals who had skills, were they, when you see them teaching their children, blacks and gentlemen with the ship's culture, whatever, you find that there's a familiar line.
Yeah.
Where they try to make sure that
Right. Yeah, it's true both ways. If you won't be disrespectful if you need to go. So I don't want you to feel like you're stuck here. If you've got something you got to do, you got to go. Please feel free to go. It works both ways. If again, the majority of people who are working out in the fields, who are working outdoors and doing that punishing, work from can C to can't, 6.5 days or maybe 6 days a week, those people are going to, if you start out like a Frederick Douglass in a rural area, maybe he would have gotten a chance given his obvious talents, He might have gotten a chance to become a blacksmith or a cooper or a wheelwright, you know, a skilled worker on a plantation, because plantations had all those jobs. But it was more likely that whatever his father did, of course Douglas knew he didn't know his father, but his mother was a field worker. So it's much more likely that he would have been a field worker, because that was the way that tended to work, and it also tended to work the same way if you were in a higher echelon kind of job. If your family was known as so, there are examples of slave narratives whose fathers were also higher echelon, and then they move into, they learn a similar trade, and so yeah, it sort of perpetuates a certain class of workers at both the higher and the lower. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Not a question. There are two things that I think of following your lead, which I think is a rich one: the culture, the relationships among the slaves themselves and among the enslavers themselves. Orlando Patterson, a sociologist from Harvard, makes a great deal of light on the point that you were making. Mm-hmm. In Frederick Douglass's first narrative, he says, I used to wonder why many blacks did not run away towards slavery. And then he followed up by saying, it was because they had friends, and it was difficult to leave your friends behind.
That's
if
exactly
you couldn't
right.
carry them with you.
That's right. One of the things I talk about in my book is the identities of the fugitives, because there are a lot of people who wrote narratives who were not fugitives. They bought their freedom, and they wrote about their lives, and they wrote about how they bought their freedom, and they wrote about why they bought their freedom. And most of the people who bought their freedom were family men or women. They bought their freedom because it was the safest way to keep the family together. We might look at it today and say, oh, you compromised with slavery, you bought your freedom. No. They were thinking first and foremost about what's best for my family, and they decided the best way to try to keep my family together is to buy freedom. Whereas almost all of the people who were fugitives were single, male, unattached. Like Frederick Douglass, who, you know, his mother was dead, his grandmother was dead, he was living in Baltimore, all of his family were really way out on the eastern shore. When he escapes, the only person he's really leaving behind is his fiancée. But she's already committed to his making the escape. She's sold a mattress and puts her money together with the money that he's made working as a caulker, even after he's been turning over most of the money to his enslaver. And that's the way that they buy the tickets for him to ride the boats and the trains to get him to New York City. So in that case, he's got a loved one, but instead of her being kind of a drag on his trying to get away, she's actually on, fully on board. But most of the narratives are written by people who run away and they don't have families, and it makes it a lot easier emotionally. Though it's still not easy, because in many cases, when I said they don't have families, I mean they don't have a spouse and children of their own, but then they have mothers, they have fathers, they have grandparents, and they've got to leave those people behind. And in some cases, they know, how do I do this when I know what's going to happen to my mother when the master finds out that I'm gone? He's going to come in and he's going to beat her and demand to know from her. So in this particular case, a man named Francis Frederick, who published his autobiography in 1863, he didn't tell his mother. He just ran away. No one knew. He was gone until he was gone. It's one of the most reprehensible things about slavery. Any other questions?